best at this moment in time. Oh, okay. Everybody's ready to go? All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Kathy. I'm one of the artists in residence here at Zaratan, along with my good colleague Kim in the audience, and I work in the mode of writing, fiction to be precise. I'm sorry to not be able to present this to you in Portuguese. It's a beautiful, complex language that you converse in here, and I can only be humbled, especially as a monolingual, at how prevalent bilingualism is here. In that bumbling around in my clumsy tourist ways, I have people accommodate for me by switching so seamlessly to English. And even when the language barrier does pose somewhat of a challenge, I am reminded of one evening I tried to find the Museum of the Orient from Zaratan, and I had to go under a bridge. I was walking on the wrong side of the street that wouldn't have allowed me to descend, and an extremely gracious woman was trying to tell me this, even as it became apparent that neither of us could speak each other's language. Somehow we make do. I'll be the first to admit that I struggled with this presentation for you. Being here at Zaratan, where as a gallery there is inevitably considerable emphasis on the visual aspect of art, I have little to offer in the way of images in the most conventional sense, which is a shame because Lisbon, which I have had the pleasure to learn in my time here, is a feast for the eyes. You have your buildings painted yellow and pink, your tiles and their intricate designs, your tendencies towards monuments and statues, your galleries upon galleries upon galleries. My first introduction to Portuguese art was not so much through its literature, but through the visual artist Paula Rego, where I had snuck into a presentation on her artistic preoccupations, the evolution of her style, and before I even had a chance to fully tour Casa Fernando Pessoa, or Casa dos Bicos, current home of the José Saramago Foundation, I wandered the spacious rooms of the Museum of Contemporary Art. The image is a commanding form. It capitalizes on the power of immediacy. For most, it is the optimum mode for comprehension and retention, and, if the image is any good, lingers like a neon sign at night lingers on the retina, well after closing your eyes. Writing, or more specifically the writing that I do, is bereft of images, but not, I should note, imagery. My first access point to fiction truly has been through imagery. I grew up reading speculative fiction, the genre of the strange and fantastic, and it's the genre I have identified with most in my writing. When people speak of speculative fiction, their experience of it, the craft of it, they often do so in conjunction with this notion of world building, the creation of fictional worlds, often with real-world analogs. This is where imagery abounds. Today I want to talk to you about world building, which is to say, I want to talk to you about an alternate way of seeing, the art and value of seeing slowly, and the tension that comes out of seeing and relaying what we see to others, with our sight inevitably mediated by the reader's oft-varied experiences. And hopefully I can introduce to you myself, my work, my influences, and what I have been taking in at this residency, and this visually rich city of Lisbon along the way. 1. So when we discuss good world building, we often mean that we were taken in by its descriptive construction. Were the right details and enough details presented to us that we felt that this fiction could be a reality? Description then really boils down to style, and this is especially so when we move into the first-person point of view, where we can comment on and experiment with different degrees of subjectivity, even asking ourselves if there really is truly anything objective in this world. There is a lot to say about the eye, about character. We can say so directly in our authoritative role as a writer, but compelling writing must work on multiple levels, acknowledging your ability to think critically, as well as separately from the characters as a reader. Just as when someone recounts to you the events of a night when you were not there, perhaps drinking too much green wine and listening to fado, sorry, I can't resist the cultural references, and you calibrate your reception of their tale according to their character. Would you trust the details less if this person was a stranger, believe it a bit more if they were your friend, or perhaps even a bit less because having known them for so long, you know better the faults in their memories or mode of speaking? We must always be thinking, as readers, who is telling me this story? What am I being told? And what am I not? And of course, the significant question, why? Why is this person telling me the story? Why am I being told what I am being told? And why am I missing information if I am? Why is how we access character. So let's assume I'm a character within a fiction. the fiction of the here and now, and you are reading my story. When I recount my adventures in Lisbon to you, I do so as a foreigner. I was born and raised on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver, Canada. And when I left, I felt like I knew the urban terrain quite intimately. Consequently, this familiarity rendered the city invisible to me, the minutiae lost as I merely focus on the destinations of the moment. There's a shorthand I use when describing the city to locals, and you might notice this in some of the fiction that comes from that region. Offhand sentences like, I take the SkyTrain, I'm at Waterfront Station, I live in East Van. When I communicate to you like this, in this sparse kind of language, I may act as if you are a fellow Vancouverite, but you should recognize that I am signaling my own position as a local. To arrive in Europe, in Lisbon no less, and suddenly be immersed in all this newness, from the neoclassical architecture to the abundance of ceramic sardines and tiles on display in the tourist shops, to the vibrant colors and billowy fabrics of the fashion worn here, better suited for balmy weather, I notice anything and everything. To me, Lisbon is speculative fiction come to life. I found myself walking the same streets repeatedly and being unable to recognize them. I would see something new about them each time. Textually, this onslaught of information can be useful at conveying how the character is not of this place. And it is important to note that just as being confronted with novel sensory information in real life forces us to take pause, world building on the page slows the reader down. Paragraphs are often longer, denser, and our eye, the eye of the imagination, only ever roves from a fixed pivot, taking a panorama of the situation. Of course, newness is an ephemeral thing. One cannot be new forever. I still consider myself new to Lisbon, yes, especially in relation to all of you, but I'm not the same kind of new as I had been just stepping off the plane and struggling to find Zartan in the late hours. The timing in which we introduce world building into the text is therefore critical to the tool's effectiveness. As we set the foundation of its infrastructure, we then need to develop a focus, to become more selective of what we are seeing, so that we can create a narrative arc, add movement when we are once stagnant. As I became more acquainted with Lisbon, I naturally drew up my own landmarks to give me a sense of direction, and it bodes well as a reader to pay attention to what proves salient for either native or foreigner, as other aspects of the world inevitably recede. What captures my gaze now? Recently, I learned of the symbolic significance of the swallow, romantic fidelity, and home. You've caught me at a liminal moment. Not more than 2 days before reaching Lisbon, I left my suitcase with all my belongings in it at a friend's flat in the UK, where at the end of the summer I will relocate after having only ever lived in one place my entire life. Home, what it means, and how I will find it anew has been on my mind. And so, walking into the gift shop, I tell you I see the ceramic swallows. Wandering the streets, I tell you I see the swallow painted on the walls. Retreating to Zartan at the end of another day, I tell you I see live swallows flitting above me, emerging and disappearing over the rooftops of the buildings. This, despite everything else. This is the kind of seeing we create through writing, mediated through character. And I think we can understand better now that although writing gives the ostensible sense that we are gazing outward through the character's eyes, the power of writing, truly, is that it is an inward-gazing form. We read as much into who is narrating our story as we are learning about the world through them. 2. What does it mean when we choose to leave home, are evicted from our homes, discover another home, possess multiple homes, or find ourselves in a state of temporary or even permanent homelessness? What roles do migration play in all this? These are questions I try to explore not only personally in this moment in my life, but also professionally in my practice. When I write speculative fiction, I guess you could say I specialize in the horror story. Particularly, I'm interested in how we become haunted by a place, how the external ultimately obliterates or nourishes the internal, and vice versa, how our internal intentions can be literalized into external machinations, like the specter, like the ghost. I speak of hauntings in their more conventional sense, and a broader sense, which I'll elaborate on soon. I believe that place leaves an indelible impression on the very fabric of our beings, and the most effective way for me to convey this is through the slow, or accumulated seeing that we encounter in literature. We've already discussed how our current worries and aspirations affect our way of seeing. This is the present and future coming into play, but the past has a lot to do with it too. Where we came from, what factors were at work to make our environment the way it is or was, even before we had a claim to some existence here, has a profound impact on our way of seeing. When I tell you I was born and raised on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, I'm telling you perhaps many things, but two of which I wish to highlight for you. The first being that I was born into democracy. Although Canada, since its independence from Britain, has always been formally democratic, and we are furthermore neighbored by the United States, a country that positions itself quite vociferously as democratic, as I understand it, Portugal's transition to democracy is an extremely recent one. Its dictatorship modeled on some of the fascist movements that were spreading across Europe in the 20th century like a fever. When I see a tribute to democracy here, like the Carnation, for example, it reminds me, as someone with the privilege to consider democracy as the norm, the importance of fighting for democracy. But what does that fight truly entail? No doubt the Carnation to the local here bears a weightier significance because they know from their own experience or the experiences relayed to them through their parents or grandparents what exactly this fight means and how much it has impacted their lives. When we find ourselves uprooted and outside of Portugal, do you think the meaning of the Carnation ever truly leaves us? Do you think we cease to see the Carnation anymore when we are far from home? A Canadian writer I was put in touch with recently told me she flew to Portugal this year on April 25th in honor of her parents, who had fled during the dictatorship to ensure her educational opportunities. I'm sure before I came to Lisbon and learned more about Portuguese culture and history, if we had visited a florist in Vancouver together and were both offered a carnation, this detail would have registered with her more profoundly than it would have with me. I might have forgotten the carnation in an instant. Try as we might, we cannot be ahistorical beings. My first week here, I lucked out by sharing a ride to Salvento with an American writer who was telling me about the shape she was seeing everywhere, the quatrefoil. I feel like I am being haunted by this shape, she said. I thought that was the most delicious description for the feeling, because can we not say the same for the imagery of our homes that make themselves known to us, whether we are near or far, that we are not only seeing in accordance with what is on our minds now and for the future, but the history that has shaped our present and future? I want to acknowledge the deeply private aspects of our nature. What writing accomplishes is a subtle way to communicate our struggles and preoccupations. Perhaps you've heard of the term infodumping regarding world building, especially the speculative kind, and with exceptions, it's generally considered a clumsy execution of the art form, where the sole purpose is to tell you what you need to know more or less by brute force. One of the reasons why infodumping strikes us the wrong way, I would argue, is that it doesn't consider our private selves. How realistic is it for a stranger to tell us everything about themselves when we first meet them? And if we were marked out for such a rare and curious experience like that, can we say after we have finished talking to them that we now know truly everything about them? Ultimately, we must concede that we are distinct entities from each other, a vast and impregnable fortress of unknowability separating us. And the sad and beautiful truth is that trying to understand someone fully, despite the impossibility of that feat, takes a lifetime's effort, and then some. Generally speaking, the closer something is to someone's heart, be it our ancestral history, our cultural inheritance, the extent to which we are afforded liberty, which I've just discussed, all of which directly speak to our fears, aspirations, aversions, and values, the more fiercely people guard it, and the longer it will take for them to disclose their own feelings on it for you. Good writing acknowledges this. What it gives us is time. We start out by noticing what the character notices, and as we gaze further inward through their outward looking, we gradually get a sense of what they omit to us in their seeing, what they pretend they don't see. I was told it is difficult for Portugal to talk of its fascist history because it is so recent. Either this period was a time you lived through, or your parents did, or your grandparents. No generation is yet fully free from its memory. What happens when we read of a former dissident, for example, who willfully omits remark on the flags of Portugal that decorate major landmarks, like the São Jorge Castle here, for instance, landmarks that were perhaps renovated for propagandist purposes during the dictatorship? What can we read into that avoidance? Pain? Trauma? Regret? There are perhaps things we have seen in this world that we will wish we could unsee, and we may spend our entire lives in this mode of unseeing because to be confronted with the reminders of all that has happened before is too fearsome to bear. And sometimes we don't see things because we were never trained to or had to. This is privilege. The second piece of information you can glean from my words, I was born and raised on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, is that I have inherited a horrific and inarguably ongoing history of colonization. To illustrate, since 2021, in British Columbia, my own province, hundreds of soil anomalies have been detected on the sites of former residential schools. And it's been suspected that these soil anomalies are indeed the unmarked graves of numerous Indigenous children. The residential schools were tools implemented by the Canadian government and supported by Christian churches to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the Eurocentric culture. The last residential school did not shutter until 1996, and although 94 calls to action have been drawn up by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 to allow for healing from this human rights atrocity, as of 2023, only 13 have been completed. It could therefore take until 2081 at this rate for Indigenous peoples to achieve something in the semblance of reconciliation. Still, the systemic subjugation of Indigenous peoples is a history many Canadian settlers, including myself, are only beginning to educate ourselves on. And even this concept of choosing to educate ourselves when Indigenous peoples would have had no choice in the matter as a means for survival is a privilege that allows for blind spots. Coming to Lisbon, therefore, bearing the knowledge of this genocide in my own home and learning about Portugal's own colonial history, I'm perhaps sensitized to markers and suggestions of colonial violence. But as a friend of mine once remarked, coming from colonized lands is different than living on the lands of a colonizer, where the true impact of colonial violence can be camouflaged more easily and insidiously. When we look around Lisbon and note that, yes, it is a city of monuments and statues, do we question the monuments and statues that should have been here but are missing? Who are the people who have built and are integral to the very fabric of this country but remain invisible to us for various social, political, and economic reasons, which is to say the Afro-Portuguese? I would encourage you all, after this presentation is over, to talk with Kim in the audience, whose art deals directly with Portugal's colonial involvement in Africa and who has extensive knowledge on the African and Black diaspora more generally as it relates to a global slave trade. My only small point to make is that often we need time to recognize the outlines caused by blind spots for what they are and how they've come to be, and this is one of the great powers of writing. 3. A question that comes up a lot in writing workshops is intention. What did the author intend, and does the text read that way? In workshop, when the writing is still in draft form, we try our best to help the writer to get their writing as close as possible to what they want to communicate. And really, what I like about writing is the control it affords me to say what I want, how I want it. Still, like all genres of art, when it's finally out there and I'm not physically present to clarify my thoughts, some of that control is wrested from me by the audience, and it's up to them to take what they can from the writing. It's an equal parts frightening and enthralling prospect. The mediated property of the reader you'll find acknowledged in literary criticism when critics shy away from the statement, "the author meant this," deferring instead to the more accurate, "the text suggests this," because what is suggested by the text depends a lot on the reader's expertise and experience. A fictional character is a mimic of real life, but all the complexities and contradictions of being a person really belong to us. Everything that we hold secret and near gets entangled in what we experience, priming us to notice some details of a story and disregard others out of a deliberate or unconscious privilege and bias-driven blindness. I think good writing communicates its ideas clearly, but I think better writing gives space for the reader to come to their own conclusions, providing readings that withstand and surpass social, political, economic, and geographic divisions, and even time and the evolutions of understanding one another that come out of it. Because if the writing addresses something about being human, the one commonality among all of us that we were born with, that is our right, that can never be taken from us, and that must be acknowledged in our interactions with one another, even as it is something that others may try to deny. Then it endures. In this presentation to you, I talked about speculative fiction and my favorite type of speculative fiction, the ghost story. I talked to you about the makings of effective speculative fiction through world building, and really that was a sly way of talking to you about character, because that is what a lot of the emotional pull of writing thrives on. It's the characters that make us care. If a character is likable or even despicable, if we can relate in some way, come to an understanding of who this character is, that teaches us something, doesn't it? About whom we are, about why we're here. I was asked recently, who do I write for? I feel like I can only answer this question by addressing a little bit more about why I write. I write for the foreigner because in many ways, I feel foreign to this life. Not just in Lisbon, although being a Canadian in Portugal is perhaps the sensation of foreignness intensified, but these feelings of loneliness, confusion, fear, excitement, and hope that are felt so intensely during travel, that can also be felt just as acutely at home. Haven't we all experienced some of this at some point? Haven't we all felt to some degree foreign in our predicaments? Again, I am reminded of that woman who tried to direct me down the right path to go under the bridge. She was probably clued into how I was not from around here by the way I crossed the street, jerkily, with much trepidation. On a side note, I am aware of how boldly the Portuguese cross the street around here. In Vancouver, pedestrians have the right of way too, but I could never. Anyways, the differences between us, foreign English speaker, and local Portuguese speaker were stark. But I would gather that she must have seen some of the bewilderment in me that she could probably empathize with, enough at least to reach out. And after some time and much gesticulation, I understood her. I went down the correct path. Knowing that we are fundamentally different, knowing that we are fundamentally similar, taking the time to try for understanding, for that connection, for that reaching, in spite of, and because, this is why I write. Okay. So I've taken enough of your time already, but no presentation is truly done without acknowledging some of the help received in making it. Thank you so much to Zartan and the fabulous team behind it that has helped us through what has proved to be a month full of wondrous and at times spooky surprises. Elżbieta, Gemma, and Jose, and Felix at the front, and for the conversations that have inspired much of this talk. Thank you, too, to my colleague and roommate Kim, who has shown me much care throughout this experience. And thank you to this wonderful audience, because despite all the things you could have done today, you chose to spend some time with me, a stranger, and I am eternally grateful for that. And one last thing before I go, I should add the disclaimer that I'm still very much a pupil of my practice, and literature, furthermore, is vast, with exceptions to every rule and observation. What I've said has probably been said with greater insight and clarity by other writers, artists, and thinkers before me, and this presentation should be taken as more of a primer of the ideas that come out of engaging with literary works than anything definitive or even prescriptive. So take what you want, leave what doesn't serve you. If anything, my principal objective is for you to come away with deeper questions about how you yourself see and communicate your own seeing the world. And in answering those questions, further your own art, as I am sure there are many artists in this room. And I hope we can operate in this tradition here of art, begetting art, begetting art. Everyone, thank you so very much. Any questions? None? Thank you. Thank you. I was so nervous, but everybody here has been so kind, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No, I'm the one who needs to check the story. Just reading it the other way around.
Yes, please contribute to the ghost story. Make it longer.
I know it very well.
It has like a story that you tweet and a little bit. I didn't do it because
Okay.
I started yesterday. I put.
You did.
Oh, wonderful!
It was the first sentence after. I think it was yours, the first one.
It was the tea, the sentence
Yeah,
about the
yeah,
tea.
it's you,
Incredible!
right?
I loved it. I was thinking, wow. I think at some point we'll probably go through lemonade or like I don't know, espresso or something. Yeah, but it's always so interesting to think about who wrote it. So yes. It does feel a little bit like ghosts in some ways. You go into the room and then you think, oh, somebody has been here. Somebody wrote on the paper. I don't know. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Obrigado.
Very good job.